Well, here we are 18 months or so into the coronavirus pandemic, and the U.S. economy is still several million workers below where we were pre-pandemic. The virus itself has been a challenge in trying to build back the economy, but some other dynamics are at play, and they have added a level of complexity maybe was not as expected right at the outset. A pleasure to be joined to discuss this with Bernard Anderson, who's a professor emeritus at the Wharton School in the Center for Human Resources. He was also Assistant Secretary of Labor during the Clinton administration. Professor, great to have you with us today. Thanks for a few moments.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be with you.
Thank you. So we just had the August jobs report released. Let me get your thoughts on that and also where you think we are in terms of the labor force overall.
Well, the increase of jobs, 235,000, was disappointing. But what that shows is that the economy continues on a path of recovery from the pandemic contraction that was initiated in early 2020. But the path of recovery now has a bump in the road. And that bump in the road is the surge in the Delta virus, which does two things with respect to the labor force. First of all, it reduces consumer spending. And consumer spending is 2/3 of economic growth. It also creates job shortages in a number of industries, and that creates problems with achieving stable, balanced economic growth that will generate a return to economic growth that will benefit all Americans. Now, let me add that 1 month statistics never tell the full story. And if we look at the 3-month moving average, we see that there were 765,000 new jobs each month between June and August. And that is the rate of economic growth and job creation that we really need to see in order to bring the economy back to the level where it was before the pandemic.
It's interesting because I think when you talk about a lot of the issues around supply chain and there is a level of product demand out there. We obviously see a lot of automakers, having produced a lot of vehicles to a point, stopping because of the chip shortage being a factor here. You would think that that would probably make hiring easier, but I guess it really hasn't been in a variety of different sectors. And it's almost like we're starting to see maybe a bit of a new normal in terms of what businesses are offering, but what the consumer or what the potential hiree wants to have from a job.
Well, it's interesting that the pandemic created an economic contraction unlike a normal variation in the business cycle. What it does by creating policies that are intended to constrain the expansion of the virus is get people not to associate with each other. That has a devastating effect on business activity in the service sector. And that then ratchets down into other areas of the economy, and particularly the labor force. And I said that is like a shifting of when an earthquake occurs and you have a shifting of the plates. That's what we are seeing in the economy now. This is a most unusual business cycle, which is generated by what's necessary to contain the spread of the virus.
I know you've also looked at the racial disparities in the labor market that we're seeing at the moment. We've obviously heard about the impact on people of color during this time of the pandemic. How does that continue to impact those groups of people, especially around the labor market?
The situation is this, Dan. Racial inequality in the American employment is broad, it is deep, and it is persistent. The rate of unemployment for Black workers has been at or above twice the rate of unemployment since the statistics were first collected by race in 1954. The Black unemployment rate for youth is 3 times the rate of youth unemployment for whites. That is a normal pattern of employment discrimination and disparity that covers through good times and bad. Now, what impact did the pandemic have on this? Well, it turns out that the pandemic created massive unemployment in those industries in which there was a disproportionate number of Black workers employed, especially low-wage Black women. The nature of the pandemic, imposing as it did restrictions on people gathering together, creating lockdowns, reducing people coming together in places of work and so forth, knocked a disproportionate number of Black workers out of jobs. And what's necessary to correct that is to get the virus under control, get people back to work, increase more jobs, when hopefully those people who were unemployed will be recalled to work. But here's the problem. The nature of the virus is such that it creates a barrier to people coming back to work. Many people who are not vaccinated are afraid to go back to work because they might contract the virus. Others are unable to go back to work because of the schools closing and childcare obligations. And there are a number of other personal experiences and obligations that workers have that prevent them from going back to work. One other factor that is should be mentioned is the high rate of unemployment compensation that was put in by the stimulus program the federal government adopted, which in some cases, I will say, provides more income for workers being unemployed than the workers received when they were the discretionary income they received when they were working. So that affects the interest in some workers, at least, in going back to work, as long as those unemployment benefits are provided. Now, it turns out that those unemployment benefits expired this month. They expired the other day. So we will see going forward whether the elimination of the unemployment compensation will have the effect of drawing more people back into the workforce.
I think that doesn't that also become a very important component when you think longer term? I mean, obviously, in the scope of where we are right now and getting people back in the workforce, I think it's important, but it's almost a little bit of a case study when you think about how to tackle significant times in the history of our country moving forward.
Yes, it does. But these are special circumstances generated by this health crisis that we have not seen before. Right. So I don't expect us to experience this type of business cycle again anytime in the near future.
There's also the side to this, which is obviously, as you mentioned, a lot of monetary policy that is being brought into play here to try and help the economy get through this. But we're also at a time of such, social change as well, that social policy is probably going to have a significant impact on where we're headed, and thinking about something like education as we move forward.
Well, let's be clear. The Federal Reserve Board has the responsibility to set monetary policy. And the Fed is under an obligation to set monetary policy according to the dual mandate, which is aimed at achieving maximum employment and price stability. That is the obligation of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, let me say that there is no specific unemployment rate that is equal to maximum employment. Maximum employment does not mean full employment. In order to measure maximum employment, we look not only at the unemployment rate, but also at other measures of labor force participation, like the labor force participation rate, the employment population ratio, the number of workers who are long-term unemployed, that's more than 6 months, the number of workers who are involuntary unemployed, the number of workers who are discouraged workers. We look at a number of different measures of the labor force in order to determine when the economy reaches maximum employment. But because of the racial disparities, we find that even when we reach maximum employment, the unemployment rate for Black workers tends to be significantly higher than that for white workers.
Right.
And that is unacceptable. It is morally unacceptable. Not only that, but we know that there is something we can do about the racial disparity in employment. You mentioned education. It is the case that educational differences in skill level of education and so forth between African Americans and whites does contribute to a higher rate of unemployment because of the difference in hiring standards that employers have. But when labor markets get tight, employers have a tendency to reduce their hiring standards. And under those conditions, a number of Black workers who would under other circumstances not be hired will be hired. But there is not enough of that long enough to significantly reduce the racial disparity in employment. Let me give you an example of this. If you look at the data from January through August, what you find is that when the economy was generating 600,000, 700,000 jobs per month, the rate of unemployment for Black workers declined. And in those circumstances, we saw a narrowing of the Black-white unemployment gap. It was 1.5, I think, in February or March. It increased to 1.7 in July, I think. But in August, there was a reduction in unemployment among white workers, an increase in unemployment among Black workers. And so the Black-white unemployment ratio, that gap, shot back up to 1.97. So even in this churning of the labor force associated with the variation in job creation, we're seeing that persistent racial gap in employment come back again. And that is a problem.
How much, and I would imagine that these were issues that were at the forefront of your mind in your time in the Clinton administration, correct?
Yes. Now, it's interesting that you raised that point. Let me mention that Bill Clinton made equal employment opportunity a high priority in his administration. And in fact, there was a higher proportion of African Americans appointed to cabinet positions, sub-cabinet positions like the one I held, and other political appointees during the Clinton administration. Not only that, Bill Clinton, in a national speech after conducting a study of affirmative action, announced that instead of changing affirmative action, we should strengthen it. He said, mend it, not end it. In addition, The Clinton administration significantly increased the expenditures for job training, especially job training for youth targeted on communities there where there was high minority unemployment and high poverty. So we know what we can do to address this issue. The question is, where there is a will, there is a way. There has not been enough will on the part of administrations to consistently impose this. I was the assistant secretary for Employment Standards Administration, responsible for enforcing the minimum wage, affirmative action employment, workers' compensation, and something else. I had a $4.4 billion a year budget when I was Assistant Secretary of Labor. I concentrated on OFCCP enforcement. That's the Office of Federal Contract Enforcement program, which requires that all companies with government contracts have affirmative action plans. In 1990, between 1997 and 1999, we were able to reach $48 million in settlements for employment discrimination, including, since we're doing the interview in Philadelphia, a $4.8 million settlement for Core States Bank that was discriminating against women in wage discrimination, paying women different wages for jobs and financial services and so forth. It is a very complicated issue, but the institutional discrimination is deep set to this day in the private sector, which leads to many Black people who are qualified to be employed not being employed. We need to continue to enforce anti-discrimination policies. That's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the executive order, which requires affirmative action for government contractors. We can do this, but there is a necessity to be consistent about it, to do it on a continuing basis in order to eliminate the discrimination that occurs in employment even to this day.
Let me ask you one final thing, because you're so highly regarded in the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton community for your work. You were also the first African-American tenured professor at the university. How do you think that career success can stand as an example for people in the Philadelphia community? And I'll ask you as well, as someone who grew up in Philadelphia, who was it that you looked up to when you were growing up as somebody you wanted to aspire to be like?
Let's begin by looking at the employment situation. I was privileged to be treated fairly by the Wharton School when I was hired. I completed my work for the PhD in 1969, and I was offered a position to teach in the Wharton School. Now, that offer was made to me by my professor, George W. Taylor. You might have heard of George Taylor, a tenured professor at the Wharton School, endowed chair and everything. I did very well in Taylor's course, made an A in both seminars he taught. I was also encouraged by my major professor, Herbert R. Northrop, who made it possible for me to have research money to do my research after I was hired. And he also guided my dissertation. I wrote a dissertation on this issue. The title of my dissertation was Negro Employment in Public Utilities. We were called Negroes in that day. Now we're African Americans, Black, we're other things. But the gravamen of my dissertation was to show how institutional policies of corporations in the public utility industries can contribute to racial disparities in employment. And by the way, my dissertation and the book that I wrote based on that dissertation was used as background in the famous EEOC Duke Power Company case, which established institutional discrimination as a basis of violation for Title VII. So the essence of your question is this: African Americans who demonstrate ability and potential should be hired. They should be given an opportunity. I was not the first Black person hired to teach in the Wharton School. Right. That honor was given to my major professor and my lifelong mentor, Dr. Andrew F. Brimmer, who later was the first African American appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. But when I was growing up in South Philadelphia, I am the product of a female-headed household. My mother, I remember my mother sitting at the kitchen table, studying in the course she was taking at the Berean Institute for Administrative Sciences. She got a certificate in that, took the civil service examination at the Custom House, scored a high rate on that exam, and was hired in an administrative position for the Naval Aviation Supply Depot in the Northeast, where she worked for 28 years. So I saw my mother studying, and she hammered in my head the importance of getting an education. That's what led me forward. But there were other people in my neighborhood and in my life Black men who inspired me. The minister of my church, the doctors who lived in the neighborhood, provided service. In those days, the doctors had offices in their homes. They don't do that anymore. The prominent civic leaders who spoke in my church and so forth. The manager of the local American store on the corner of 15th and Christian Street at that time, who used to come to our house for lunch.
Right.
These were men that I looked to as role models that I wanted to follow in my career. I've played by the rules. I have worked hard, and I've been rewarded for that. That is an opportunity that should be given to far more Black people than have the opportunity today.
Professor Anderson, thank you very much for your time. All the best to you. Look forward to talking to you again, sir.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So long.
Thank you. Bernard Anderson, who is a Professor Emeritus at the Wharton School.